My name's Ronnie Hughes, and the title of the exhibition here at the MAC is Isobar. The title Isobar comes really from the idea of it being a drawing, in a sense, that's of something that's actually imaginary or something that's not there. In some ways, it feels, when you see a map of isobars, it feels like we're looking at something that's to do with nature, but in many ways it's complete conceit, it's a cultural invention. And that idea of whether something is real or not or whether it's something that we have sort of conjured up to create a kind of structure in the world, that's something that's of interest to me, and it runs throughout my work in general and this show in particular. My work is interested in the idea of structure or underlying order within things in general, and the work's really primarily process driven, and at a certain point a few years ago I elected to let go of trying to impose myself, my own kind of ideas upon it, and just to kind of work with the process of each painting and build and work with the painting towards its resolution, and in some ways completely surrendering any idea of I guess my own personality within that, but with the idea that underneath there's something that something subliminal or something that sits within us that makes pattern appear. When I do make structures, it's the idea of trying to get at something that's complex. I think complexity makes things much more interesting and much more like things in nature than the very kind of simple structures that we work with in all facets of human activity, whether it's in architecture or in language. We work in very obvious kind of ways. And so for me, a lot of the time with creativity, it's about trying to introduce ways that thwart those very simple ways we impose ourselves upon things, and try and just find ways to sort of intervene, or let nature intervene probably, to create something that's just much more interesting to look at. In terms of making abstraction, I mean, I've said before, and in some ways it sounds funny, I'm not really interested in abstraction in a particular way, or not really certainly in an historical sense of what that means. I don't see abstraction as actually existing. When I started off, I think around about 1995, when I moved to Sligo first, up until then I'd been making work that was figurative and ideas and issues based, and for a variety of all sorts of reasons I wanted to jettison all that completely, and I had a very difficult period. I had a notion in my head of making abstract paintings that didn't mean anything. It was a way of just trying to escape, or to just remove the kind of shackles of all the things that had imposed themselves upon me before. And I had a very difficult year and a half in the studio before I made the first painting that felt like my new work at the time, or where I'd turned the page over. Looking back now, I had removed a lot of stuff from the work. It wasn't as new as I thought it was, because you bring yourself with you all the time. Nonetheless, I also realised that in trying to relinquish meaning, you can't run away from it. There's that famous Guston quote, "Painting is impure, we are image makers and image ridden." And I think that's the case, that in trying to get away from ideas, we realise that everything that we look at, we use as a prompt to think. Things either have mimetic or have associative properties. I found myself anyway trying to discard everything that was there before, and realising that I couldn't. And then that, in a sense, then it opened the door for me and allowed me just to feel free and to kind of make the work that I wanted to, and to anything that I was saying, I wasn't saying it obviously. I was saying, the paintings then became a lot more cryptic than they perhaps had been before. And that's continued to be the case over the last 20 or so years, just as the work has evolved. Any person, I don't know if it's just any artist, any person, when you're walking around on the earth, you're carrying your your baggage with you, you're carrying your life with you, the experiences that you've had, and the things that you think about. And I don't know. I mean, I was watching a program about creativity and why are people creative, and one thing that kind of comes up again and again is when people have to carry two competing ideas in childhood, and that seems to be a big prompt for a lot of artists, in all sorts of fields, because early on they have to really grapple with something about the nature of what things are. And I certainly felt that experience from my early life. As I said, I was born in Belfast. My parents were a mixed marriage, and we left Belfast, close to the outset of the Troubles, really because we were a mixed marriage, and we kind of moved around a bit. And wherever we lived then, wasn't so much all that rigmarole about kind of Northern Ireland, but there was definitely for me as a child always a sense of trying to come to terms with these sort of polarities that I could see in different types of ways that were causing all this carnage at times around me in life. And that was something I always kind of worked with and felt about. And I definitely remember as a young child that being something that was very important, or something that was problematic for me. And so I always felt as a person I was negotiating with that, and you negotiate that within various ways, just as a person in your day-to-day life, as a citizen, in a sense, but also in your interior life, in terms of, I've been asked to provide a reading list. So, when the books and the ideas that are important to me, all in a sense work with this idea of a kind of protagonist working within a situation where there's a system, breaking down in some respects. So in many ways, there's a lot of stuff that rattles around in your mind when you're in the studio. But the other sort of important Guston quote is that one, like when you start off making a painting, there's a whole bunch of people in your studio with you, your parents, your friends, people who taught you, and one by one they all leave, and eventually it's just you and the painting, and then you leave and the painting's there. And I really relate to that. That's how the kind of paintings get made. And it's interesting at the end, or the start, when you go into a gallery, when the work then has its own kind of life, and particularly when you look at a body of work, it's really interesting to see how everything kind of knits together. But it never feels like it knits together when it's in the studio. Unusually, with a lot of the work, I've made two types of each, way of painting, I suppose. So there's a thicket 1 and a thicket 2. There's Dazzle and Blink are two paintings but have a very similar structure, but a different type of outcome. And for me, it was interesting just to almost like as a sort of experiment, to set it up and to start off with the same type of conditions, whether that's creating a grid to begin with, or creating a particular type of armature for the painting, and then just letting it go and develop and see what happens. And it's interesting to look between one and the other. So there's a bit of that, which is, it's not something I typically do, I have to say. One pairing, in a sense, so I have two paintings that are the same size. One's called Palimpsest, and one's called Waltzer, and they don't look the same at all. And I started making Waltzer, and the plan, I was going to make a different type of Waltzer. But then I thought, with that painting, I'm going to do something else. So there's a series of drawings that are down there called Artificial Birdsong Series, and I had made those with a text. I'd cut out stencils that said Artificial Birdsong. In 2015 when I made those drawings, and I had those letters still, the cut out letters, and so I used those then, I kind of dropped them randomly onto an overhead projector and projected them onto the painting. I like the idea of, like birdsong in my studio in the summer, I'm out in the countryside and there's a real sort of din of noise from all sorts of birds. When you hear them, you can never actually hear one. It's very hard to pick them out because there's so many going all at once, and there's this sense of almost of dissonance when the sounds kind of overlap. So I like this idea of, this text, the same letters being used, or the same syntax, I suppose, in a way, being used to create something that's sort of confusing, but I guess analogous with the idea of birdsong. And so then it was just to figure out how to make this into a painting, so that I ended up with a particular solution for that painting where I painted the two different sets of text, and then where they intersected, I made a different colour there. So you end up with this graphic. It's a painterly painting, but it's quite a graphic image, and it's quite unusual in that it's like a sort of early Dadaist kind of type Dada poster or something, and it's an odd note in a funny way in my work, but it may seem like that to people, but working with a letter is no different than working with a circle, or it's my own sort of personal visual vocabulary. It's just very simple structural things to work with to try and open out a way to think about or a way to look at the work. More recently, the work's just become more and more optical, and I'm more and more interested in the sort of capabilities of colour in particular to kind of do something that plays with you psychologically, as well as optically, really, and so I work with a lot more sort of high key colour now, and work with things that I guess in some ways are borrowed from aspects of op art. Work with sort of tone changes to create kind of movement, and I think a lot more about formal properties in the painting now. There are two paintings, Towers 1 and Towers 2, and how they actually came to being. I had an idea just that there would be, in a way, and I talked about palimpsest being like overlapping bird songs. They're particular, I guess, if you want to say it, like notes that are clashing with each other. And I thought with those Towers paintings that I take that very simple structure where I would have five columns, and then I would have colours appearing, colour bars in some sense appearing, but of different sizes. They're not rigidly Euclidean, I suppose. They all sort of move all over the place, and that was sort of built at random. And it's just once I decide I'm doing 5 bars, so I have a painting surface primed. I painted a sort of background colour, and then I paint two of the 5 columns. So immediately I have 5 bars, and then just off I go. I'm putting a bar here, a bar there, a bar there, all completely at random. But once you put the first bar down, the next bar that you put, even if it's over this side of the painting, I'll try this colour here in relation to that colour, and then I'll try this colour in relation to that. And you're just there. It's really quite mindless for the first few days, and it really looks horrific. But you just build and build, and towards getting somewhere where at a certain point then you have to start really making decisions in relation to how they interact and how the colours work, and then you have to, of course, it's not just about what you've put there, but sometimes you have to change it. You have to move things around. You have to change the shape. You have to change the number. You have to change the tone, or you have to change the hue or the saturation of the colours, and how they work in relation to each other. And you keep doing this, and then eventually at some point, all of a sudden, it works. It just kind of, it sits there by itself. You walk in the studio and you go, okay, that's it. I don't need to do any more.